in any other situation, if this hadn't been a mother-daughter relationship, Lane would have been charged with plagiarism. She was basically plagiarizing her mother's work.
Welcome to Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. A faint air of slight disillusion. These were the words Ursula Nordstrom, longtime editor of the Little House books, used when quoting how Roger Lee McBride described the manuscript of the first 4 years. McBride, Rose Wilder Lane's heir, had found the draft among Rose's possessions. At the time he brought it to Nordstrom, Rose had been dead for 5 months. Disillusion is an apt word. Readers have never known quite what to make of the first 4 years. It's tacked on to the end of the Little House series as if it's a mere continuation of these happy golden years. But the book doesn't really make sense. Entire scenes we've already seen play out in these happy golden years are repeated in this book, and they don't match. Spellings or names of familiar people or places are different. Almanzo is suddenly called Manly. Worst of all, this isn't our Laura. She's shrewder, less playful, and perhaps most egregious, she's having second thoughts about marrying Almanzo, the hero we've already seen her go off to live happily ever after with, in their little gray home in the West. Roger Lee McBride didn't address any of this when the book was published in 1971. He simply passed on his own conclusion that the book had been written in the late 1940s, after all the other Little House books had been published, and that Laura had lost interest in revising it after Almanzo died in 1949. We believed this because why wouldn't we? There it was in print. It had to be true. And yet, this explanation never did sit well with Little House fans, including Pamela Smith Hill. Today, she's back for part 2 of the discussion on her newest book, Too Good to Be Altogether Lost, specifically to talk about her theory on exactly how and when the manuscript for the first 4 years came to be. I hope you enjoy it. So the most exciting part of this book to me is that you advance a theory about the first 4 years that hasn't been talked about yet. And just among Laura Ingalls Wilder fans, we are all perplexed by the first 4 years. And maybe I'll even start with asking you, because you have a unique perspective to the first 4 years in that you experienced its publication in real time. And I'd like to ask you what that was like for you.
I read the first 4 years when I was, I think, a senior in high school. And I looked forward to reading it. There was a great deal of hype about it at the time. Even though by the time that the first 4 years was published, I was reading Edna Ferber and Jane Austen, and I was reading adult books at the time. I couldn't wait to get my hands on the first 4 years. And even as a high school student reading it, I thought, this doesn't make any sense. Why is Almanzo called Manly? Who is this Laura? She's kind of bitter and sour, and she doesn't want Almanzo to be a farmer, and just the whole voice, the whole style, the whole tone was depressing. It didn't seem to be a sequel. And there were small things that didn't quite fit. It didn't feel like it belonged to the Little House series at all. And so I was disappointed, and then I set it aside, just feeling let down and confused by it. It just didn't seem to make sense at all to me.
Had you looked at the first 4 years in depth before starting work on this book?
Yes, I had, because when I wrote Laura Ingalls Wilder, A Writer's Life, the biography, I was struck then with the parallels, the literary parallels between the first 4 years and Let the Hurricane Roar, which is a book that Rose Wilder Lane published in 1932. It's now been retitled as Young Pioneers, and the main characters' names have been changed. So I saw distinct parallels in style between the two books, but I assumed that, as everyone seemed to think, Wilder did in fact write the first 4 years in the 1940s. And I assumed that maybe since she was interested in writing for adults, because it did seem even then to me that this was an adult book, not a true sequel to the Little House books, that she had gone back and used Rose Wilder Lane's book as a model for the first 4 years, because there was just the way the books were structured, the style and tone were similar. But then when I started writing Too Good to Be Altogether Lost, I remembered I'd had a discussion about the book with William Anderson. And he had said that he thought somewhere in the original manuscript there was a date that indicated that the book had actually been written in the 1930s. And of course, if you look at the correspondence that Wilder and Lane had during the writing of the Little House books, there are also references to a grown-up book that Wilder was thinking about writing, thinking about in quotes. One of the letters I think dates from 1937. There are letters Wilder wrote to her agent after the completion of These Happy Golden Years. So this would be in the early 40s, when she's thinking about an adult book. Back in the 30s, Wilder also wrote her editor at Harper Brothers saying, I'm mulling something over. So when William Anderson mentioned to me that he thought there was a clue within the original manuscript itself, I thought, maybe I better go take a closer look at that original manuscript. And indeed, I found a clue that indicated that the manuscript could have been written in as early as 1932, 1933. The specific date in the manuscript is early in 1933. And that was just incredibly revealing to me. There is another clue, which I think is important as well, that could kind of clinch it. There's more than one clue. At the end of the original manuscript, Wilder quotes a poem from Edward Rowland Sills, and it's called The Fool's Prayer. And it was republished in the Atlantic Monthly in November 1932. And if you know anything about Wilder's library at Rocky Ridge Farm, there are still stacks of the Atlantic Monthly in her library. And the fact that she quotes from a poem that was republished just in 1932, and then that 1933 date, that seems to provide some significant evidence that the work was written long before she envisioned a complete series, probably between the time she had finished a draft of Farmer Boy and it was rejected, and then when she started working on the revised version of Farmer Boy. So probably it was written between the fall of 1932 and early 1933. And it's also important to note that Rose Wilder Lane was away from Rocky Ridge Farm during the fall of 1932, and there was a rift between Wilder and Lane in 1932 because of Let the Hurricane Roar. So I know that's a very complicated picture. It was a very complicated time in Wilder's life.
I love that you're talking about this. It's such a rich and illuminating interpretation of when that was possibly written that really rings more true to me than anything I've heard, which any excuses that have been offered thus far have been pretty vague. Roger Lee McBride just saying she lost interest in revising it, but that was in print. That was
and he seemed to be the authority here. Whether you subscribe to my theory or McBride's theory, I do believe the book was written for adult readers and not for even young adults. It was Wilder's attempt at an adult novel. I think that's very clear.
And you mentioned that Farmer Boy had just been rejected. So to further emphasize the context of this timeline to listeners, this is even before either Rose or Laura had envisioned this multi-book series documenting Laura's childhood.
That's absolutely true, because one of the things that I point out in Too Good to Be Altogether Lost is that Little House in the Big Woods and Farmer Boy are really mirror images of each other. Little House in the Big Woods is Wilder's recollection of her childhood, basically saving Pa's story. It's a kind of American frontier fairy tale, but it's really about her childhood, her early childhood memories. And then Farmer Boy is a novel about her husband's childhood, so that they are mirror images of each other. They parallel each other in some ways. I mean, there are real distinctions in the voice between Little House in the Big Woods and Farmer Boy, but it was a girl's story about her past and a boy's story about his past, both of them set in the 19th century. And I don't think that Wilder had yet envisioned the full series that focuses on her past and her life. So good point. Thank you for bringing that up, Sandra.
Also, sometimes I can't help thinking that trip that Rose took in the fall, part of which she dedicated to going to Malone, to her father's boyhood home, to, get him some wintergreen berries and see what it was like so she could help with the book. I can't help thinking that part of that was pure guilt.
I think you may have hit on something there. If you look at Rose Wilder Lane's diaries from that period, she wasn't happy. And even when she came back to Rocky Ridge Farm for the holidays in 1932, I think she returned in December. Mm-hmm. She was very sick and very ill. So I think she was depressed. I think the rift between herself and her mother made her very unhappy and maybe even made her more susceptible to illness, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And that trip to Malone was an olive branch back to her mother. And I think from that point on, I think they did patch it up, but things were very, very difficult and conflicted between the two of them in the fall of 1932. And for listeners who don't quite understand why they had a falling out, I just want to mention that in 1932, Wilder had published her first novel, Little House in the Big Woods. Later in 1932, Lane published Let the Hurricane Roar, and it appears that Wilder knew nothing about this book, and yet basically Lane had lifted passages, sections, characters from Wilder's unpublished Pioneer Girl manuscript and fictionalized them and put them into Let the Hurricane Roar. And in fact, the main characters in Let the Hurricane Roar are named Charles and Caroline. And so it appears that Wilder was very upset. I think in any other situation, if this hadn't been a mother-daughter relationship, Lane would have been charged with plagiarism. She was basically plagiarizing her mother's work. I will say that later on, just a few years later, the two women had patched things up completely. And Wilder was actually helping Lane with her second Pioneer novel, Free Land, which also draws directly from the Pioneer Girl manuscript. But at this point, Wilder had established herself as a successful novelist, and she was pretty secure in letting her daughter use material from Pioneer Girl. In fact, Almanzo helped on that book as well. They both did. So they patched things up. But I think in 1932, there was a great deal of tension between the two women. And it was primarily because of Rose's publication of Let the Hurricane Roar.
Which she had done basically, as far as her mother was concerned, in secret.
In secret, right. And so it's very possible that, while Lane was traveling back east, Wilder wrote the first 4 years in secret.
I picture her furiously scribbling on her Big Chief tablets. I'll show her. Who knows? As writers, do you think that Laura and Rose felt competitive with one another?
It is interesting that Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane launched their professional careers at almost the same time.
I had never put that together until I read it in your book.
They both started writing at about the same time. Rose Wilder Lane was in Kansas City, working for a newspaper up there at about the same time that Laura Ingalls Wilder started writing for the Missouri Ruralist. So it is intriguing to think that there might have been a bit of competition between the two of them. Rose Wilder Lane moved on from Kansas City to San Francisco. She began writing for the San Francisco Bulletin, and then Sunset Magazine. And she began to write for what she called the big markets, which were, of course, the national magazines that were so important during the early 20th century. Wilder herself continued to write for the Missouri Ruralist. And while it was, to most of us, just a farm magazine, it had a huge circulation, sometimes larger than the so-called big market magazines that Lane herself was writing for. But Lane felt that her mother should write for the bigger national magazines. And in the 1920s, she coached her mother on how to write for the big markets. And so Wilder wrote an article for McCall's. She wrote a couple of articles for The Country Gentleman. And Lane began to edit her mother's work for the big markets. And that really set the pattern for how they would work in the future. But we do know from the editorial correspondence between Wilder and Lane in the 1930s as Wilder was writing the Little House books, that the two women didn't always agree. Sometimes Lane, and often Lane, made really strategic and excellent suggestions about where to start a novel, the voice of the novel, how to provide more descriptive information, more concrete details, all of that. But then there were times that she just steered her mother in the wrong way, and Wilder would stand up for herself. And that's not unusual. Editors and writers often have arguments about what to do with a novel and where a novel should go. But again, what was unusual was this mother-daughter relationship, which they kept in secret. But she didn't always agree with her daughter's advice and didn't always take it. For example, Lane didn't want her mother to include Mary's blindness in the Little House books. She felt that that would be a huge mistake. And Wilder countered with, no, we have to have Mary's blindness as part of the series to go on with the book and to take the books in the direction I want to take them. And I think that's really an important and strategic decision. And again, something that sets the Little House books apart is the character of Mary, one of the first disabled characters in American literature for young children and younger readers. But she is not an object of pity. Her character doesn't really change. Mm-hmm. She remains the same kind of courageous, sweet character that she's always been. And in fact, the two sisters grow even closer together. So at any rate, getting back to your question, I think there was always some residual tension between the two writers in the family.
I guess I'm thinking of these just grand sweeping statements that Rose would make to her mother about how you're never going to make money in juveniles. And then 10 years later, you're never going to make the kind of money you make in juveniles. And,
I think that's a good point, because Lane was always disparaging Wilder's work. And she was disparaging it not just to her mother, but in correspondence to the literary agent that they shared. But I think once Wilder was determined to write the Little House series, she had a vision for it that she never lost track of. In fact, even in On the Banks of Plum Creek, there's a letter from Wilder to Lane saying, this book is about failure. It's about economic failure. It's about the harvest. It's about false hopes. She was very clear about what she wanted to do with the books. And she was not afraid to contradict her daughter, who was a very successful author by that point. We forget that at the end of the 1920s, Rose Wilder Lane was one of the best-selling female American authors of the period. She was well known then.
And one of the highest paid.
Yes, yes. Getting back to your point about the potential rivalry between the two of them and the first 4 years, I think it's in 1937 when Wilder had approached her editor at Harper & Brothers about a grown-up novel. She also told Rose about it, that she was thinking about writing a grown-up novel. And Rose discouraged her mother from doing it. And furthermore, she also said, well, even if Harper & Brothers is encouraging you to write the grown-up novel, they'll just say anything to you to keep you happy. And, if you want to do it, fine. Rose, if I had time, I'd write a juvenile book too, but I just don't have time. It's that kind of snarkiness that you get, and she's patronizing too. And then Wilder feels compelled to write back and said, well, I just mentioned it because I thought it might encourage Harper's to sell more of the Little House books. So it was just a really unsettling dynamic, I think.
I'm glad you mentioned before about Almanzo helping Rose with Freeland. I think a lot of us who have read the various biographies have heard about the questionnaire that he filled out for Rose at the time. I've always had the vague notion that Rose perhaps didn't know the first 4 years existed until after her mother's death. But recently I saw that handwritten questionnaire, which is at Hoover, the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. And up the side margin, it says, see the first 3 years or something like that. And the whole implication being that Laura and Almanzo and Rose all knew about it.
I think it's possible. I think it's very possible. But I do think that Laura and Rose came to the conclusion that these happy golden years was the best way to end the Little House series. You know, one of the things I talk about in Too Good to Be Altogether Lost is how difficult it is for an author to write a satisfying last novel in a series. It's really, really challenging. Philip Pullman has just issued the last book in his Golden Compass series about Lyra. And of course, now Lyra is an adult, young adult, and she's grown up. I haven't read the book yet. My copy hasn't arrived yet. So I'm really anxious to see how he ends it. But it's very difficult. You know, for many of us, the last book in the Harry Potter series felt off. Anyway, it did to me. It was too long. The characters didn't seem to behave the way that they had behaved in the earlier books, and their new behavior didn't seem to hold together or make sense. So it's really difficult, I think, for an author to end a popular series, a beloved series well. And these Happy Golden Years is the perfect ending to the series. It's flawless in that regard. And I think Wilder and Lane came to recognize that. And then part of me wonders too, and I'm making comparisons, I may be comparing apples to oranges here, but one of my friends, the late Eloise Jarvis McGraw, was a Newbery Honor Book author. She wrote middle grade and young adult fiction for many years, and she wrote one adult novel, and she published her adult novel fairly early in her career, but she said at one point that she realized that she was really a writer for young readers, and that was her field, and she wrote an adult novel and didn't feel like she needed to write another one. Mm-hmm. So part of me wonders if Wilder came to the same conclusion about her own career, because even in the teens, when Rose was working for the Bulletin, Wilder was publishing verse in the San Francisco Bulletin that she wrote for kids. And there's also in the 1920s a passing comment in a letter from Lane back to Wilder talking about a book for young readers that appears to have been lost, that her mother was starting to work on but didn't complete, which I think is really intriguing. So it could be that Wilder just realized she was a writer for young readers and she really didn't need to do anything with that other book. And it's very possible that in the 1930s and 1940s and into the early 1950s, Rose knew about the first 4 years, but agreed with her mother that it didn't need to be published. And it was titled The First 3 Years originally. That was the title of the original manuscript. The First 3 Years and a Year of Grace.
And a Year of Grace. Okay, just so we're absolutely crystal clear to listeners, based on all the evidence you've seen, this is your theory on when the first 4 years was likely written.
This is my theory that Wilder wrote what she titled The First 3 Years in late 1932 and 1933 in response to her daughter's novel, Let the Hurricane Roar. And Wilder wrote it because it was a subject that Rose couldn't co-opt. It didn't exist in another manuscript, as Pioneer Girl did. And she wrote it for adult readers. And she used Let the Hurricane Roar as its model, so that the style, tone, and even structure is very similar. It is a response, I believe, to Let the Hurricane Roar, and a response to Rose Wilder Lane lifting material from Pioneer Girl and publishing it in a novel in secret. And I also want to say that Let the Hurricane Roar was published in the Saturday Evening Post, which was a leading magazine of the time. This was exactly exactly what Wilder had wanted for Pioneer Girl. So not only had Lane co-opted Wilder's material, but she had published it in a way that Wilder herself had wanted for Pioneer Girl. And not only did the Saturday Evening Post publish it, Rose got a second book deal to publish Let the Hurricane Roar as a book. So she essentially sold Let the Hurricane Roar twice. This was the plan. This was Wilder's plan for Pioneer Girl. And Lane co-opted all of that and had done that in secret, apparently. So that, I think, is what prompted Wilder to write what we now know as the first 4 years.
Do you think Ursula Nordstrom made the right decision in publishing the first 4 years?
That's a very good question. On the one hand, I sympathize with Ursula Nordstrom in publishing the first 4 years. It was a manuscript from a very important and treasured, beloved American author who could resist that urge. On the other hand, I think she made a critical mistake in publishing it as a sequel. Because when you go back to that correspondence in 1937 that Wilder was having with her editor at Harper's, her editor at Harper's was interested in the grown-up story, but she referred Wilder to an adult editor, to an editor of adult books, actually to the editor who was responsible for Giants in the Earth. I think the real mistake that she made was in publishing it as a sequel. It should have been published as an adult novel. I think our impressions would have been very, very different. On the other hand, Wilder clearly had the opportunity to publish it and chose not to.
As did Rose.
As did Rose, right. I will say this about Rose. I do wonder, again, going back to that correspondence in 1937 about the grown-up novel that Wilder mentioned to Rose. And Rose discouraged her mother from writing it. That was right before Free Land came out. And I can't help but wonder if Rose worried that an adult novel from her mother might compromise the sales of her two frontier novels. That's just a private thought. I don't have any, there's no historical foundation for that except my own suspicions and the threads of comments that she makes to her mother in editorial correspondence. But I do think that might have been a consideration, at least on Rose's part.
Are you truly done with Laura Ingalls Wilder? Or is there a spark for anything new?
There is a spark. I'm just not sure I'm ready for it yet.
Pamela Smith Hill, thank you again. Now that was one great discussion, wasn't it? Most of you listening probably have your copy of Too Good to Be Altogether Lost, even if you haven't been able to sit down with it yet. If you don't, take it from us, it deserves a space on your little house shelf, because it is fascinating. Land of Laura is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band The Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Pamela, who give so generously of their time and knowledge. I hope to see you next time. Make sure you subscribe to Land of Laura on your favorite podcast channel so you can hear about episodes as soon as they drop. As Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup, and as Mom might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a little house world.